Tucker Carlson. Okay, so Tucker Carlson, he tried to apply to work at the CIA, but they quote unquote rejected him. Dang it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And now he's just doing their work while becoming a millionaire. He's also a deadhead. He's in the Deadhead documentary, I believe. So it's like, interesting. It's just a certain kind of vibe. And so like it's like he's the last person that would be able to claim any kind of like I'm a common man kind of thing, regardless of whether he was liberal or conservative. Like his whole posturing his entire life, his class background, like his dad's connections, like he is completely plugged into the system that he's like viciously criticizing now. And sometimes he does say things that are like accurate in like a kind of strict sense about like how tech companies fucking suck and they're extending their control over all of our lives and they but then there is this like victimization kind of thing. And I mean, I'll grant it to a certain point, like for sure, like there's certain things that are just like that corporate HR departments are kind of implementing right now, but I think where they go wrong.
On a lot of points, Tucker Carlson conservatism is better or more correct than at least like what he is most directly arguing against. For instance, like someone was saying, like should we stop like the automation of like the trucks so that truck drivers can keep their jobs, or is it like more important to advance? I remember Tucker Carlson saying, like, no, we should, protect the jobs, people's livelihoods.
Yeah.
And that, to me, like, at least, I could care less about the self-driving trucks and all of that stuff. Like, I feel like I don't need that. Like, the logistics of that, are stupid. I mean, we should have trains, please. Get us some trains.
But no, I mean,
the principle, at least, I find to be more relatable than, like, the idea that, like, these... Uber must be able to advance, their profits come first, their first obligation is to make more money. I definitely think that is a better principle than like the alternative. For sure. So.
And I think maybe almost in like an interesting analogous way to like how like the sort of the dirtbag leftosphere like popped up in 2016 because there just was like no media constituency for it before that, and there was no voice kind of on the left that wasn't just completely with her and like down with technocratic neoliberalism and all of that shit. And then there was like a real kind of explosion of enthusiasm and attention when the first kind of like wave of like like online media personalities or whatever, or like the first wave of like celebrities like came out of the closet like as Bernie Bros or whatever. It's kind of like Tucker spotted an opening that you could drive like a Mack truck through on the conservative right of just like their lazy like simping for free market forces and neoliberalism, and realized that like, oh, there's really potent ground here to like redirect some of this anger towards, basically, and to make it honestly like surprised me a little. Like I said, he's not the person I would peg to start talking shit about major American corporations. They don't care about you. They don't care about the country. They don't want you. They want you to rent everything. They don't want you to have children. And now JD Vance is using that in like his stump speeches, that basically like these tech companies like are creating an economic situation in which like even having children is a luxury. And that's fucked up. And like as conservatives, like we're absolutely worthless if we're not. Like I think JD Vance said maybe in his woke capital speech recently, which has some interesting observations, and then just some like epistemological like that meme where there's like a freeway exit sign and the car is just like swerving wildly like off the freeway. It's like where he just like swerves, but nonetheless like he's speaking to a certain amount of reality, and so I get why certain of like post-leftist figures are like flirting with this force, because also like what else is there out there? It's like you have neo-libs who these like bloodless neo-libs that just want to like make you take like the vaccine passport and like can like absolute establish like a biopolitical dictatorship over your life, and just like basically I don't know, like psyop your children.
They do, I think, want to. I mean, they want to do that as well. Like, they also want the state to have like a strong arm. The thing is, like, it's all a facade. Like, what they're doing basically is the same thing that libs do, where they say like, oh, you know, we're on the side of the common man against like the rich and the elites, all the while being the rich and the elites. That's what like, you know, mainstream Democrats do. I mean, Republicans previously didn't do that, and they're like, you know, well, they kind of did. You know,
they kind of did. Like, they go for the heartland kind of thing.
Well, it's actually kind of, I'm reflecting on this, it's actually pretty interesting because it's quite rare that, like, especially in American society, and the American sort of culture and the civil religion of America, which I think is inflected with Christianity. You know, in Christianity, it's, you know, it's more likely that a rich man will pass through the eye of a needle than enter heaven. You know, or sorry, a camel will pass the eye of a needle before a rich man will enter heaven, you know, right? Like, in these religions, in Islam and in Christianity, both, there's a certain, valorization attached to poverty. You know, to be poor has a certain virtue to it, you know, and certainly hoarding wealth, and being conspicuously wealthy and being arrogantly wealthy or imperiously wealthy is frowned upon, you know. And of course, in Christianity, you know, you have the whole idea of like the meek shall inherit the earth, blah blah blah. It's like and you know, American society is democratic and has these sort of liberal traditions and everything. So everyone, you know, wants to present themselves as like a common man who's in some way self-made, you know. Like if you're running for president, you're trying to get people on your side, you know, like Tucker Carlson isn't going to come out there to try to relate to people and say, like, I'm the scion of this dynasty, you know, or like George Bush isn't going to, like, you know, base his presidential campaign on the fact that he's a Bush. You know what I mean?
He's
like,
going to be clear and brush at the ranch.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, like, the idea of hereditary aristocracy or that type of thing, like, isn't like a value really in American culture. I think that some of those people maybe do. Like, I think that Vermeule probably does believe like in an elite, like aristocracy, you know?
Yeah. Well, because he's from like he's, you know, from like the Comstock, Vermeule, old Dutch lines.
The Anglo-Dutch, you know.
As he said himself. Yeah, we did find a quote there where he calls himself like, I'm, you know, basically.
I think we kept that. I think we do have that in the second hour. But yeah, he acknowledges like that he has all these shifting identities. But so I think that it's, you know, people don't tend to tout like their aristocratic bona fides. People want to be Abraham Lincoln in the log cabin. You know, that is like that's the mold of the hero in American society. So yeah, you obviously want to do that, but again, like it's a facade. You know, it's like the Sufi sheikh hanging out with the sultan, you know, or the sultan going to curry favor with the Sufi sheikh because he lives in poverty. You know, like, and get the imprimatur of the Sufi, you know, like that. It's just like
Jack Dorsey going to Nepal, like to, I don't know, like and not a lot of these speak people, for 9 months, and and
a lot of these people are hypocrites, like they're complete hypocrites, and they don't really like, you know. I think that there was something about J.D. Vance saying like, you know, we want to make sure that we have like well-raised elites or something, right? Like a well-raised ruling class. So he's not interested really in like us not having a ruling class, like as, you know, utopian of a goal as that might be. You might think from his rhetoric that he's interested in like sort of, you know, changing society so that it's less stratified and so that, you know, there's a less hierarchy. But no, they actually do believe in that stuff. It really comes down to like what values the hierarchy is preaching. And they will like, you know, and one of the values that I think we can agree on, you know, I'm Muslim. I obviously believe in like the noblesse oblige, you know, I believe that like the powerful in society have an obligation to give alms to the poor, to give alms in general, and that wealth in society should be redistributed and things like that. And that's a value that these Christians have as well, and that they attach virtue to. So that's one good value that they want their ruling class to have. But when they say like, you know, oh, the ruling class, they're not talking about the idea of there being a ruling class. No. They're talking about what the ruling class is. And like, maybe their ideal ruling class would have that Christian value of charity, but like it would also have whatever other fucked up values that they want. And it might not even ultimately manifest that value because, you know, that might end up not being high priority. Yeah. Like, you know, what might be more high priority is getting rid of all these other people before we perfect ourselves, like, you know. Well, we can't do it when we're surrounded by all these, you know, Muslims, you know, or whatever.
Or also, you know, it kind of reminds me of the passages from Volume 2 of History of the Great American Fortunes, talking about the strange position of the middle classes between the robber baron silk toppers and like the immiserated masses, and how they basically they were feeling a certain kind of anxiety as these trusts and monopolies sort of gobbled up ever larger swaths of the economy. And to a certain point, they would almost be amenable to kind of populist and, anti-elite rhetoric, but they also ultimately wanted to preserve their own system of privileges that rested upon the exploitation of workers on like a smaller scale. And so the minute that they felt like the wealthy elites could either like give them a better deal or that they had an opportunity to become some kind of elites themselves, they would immediately turn on the workers. And I think you kind of see a little bit of that energy going on here. I don't know how sincere it is at all, but it's like a kind
Myers
of...
also pointed out that he also pointed out the phenomenon that, like these political parties and like these, the silk toppers or the capitalists would always like appoint someone to be the representative and to channel those that sort of like bourgeois resentment, or even to sort of agitate against the the wealthy or the powers of the capitalists, but it would always be kind of a farce or a false choice.
Well, yeah, that's kind of how I feel about like a lot of like equity discourse these days. Is like it's kind of a diversionary tactic to basically allow like it kind of. Like,
yes, and
it obscures the kind of the movement of like the money flows that basically.
Well, and it's purely based on optics. Like when they talk about they want racial equity or something, like what they want like the anger to not be like directed towards them at all. That's what they want. They want to like ride the wave. Ride the tiger.
They want to ride the tiger. They do. And so, you could still see a certain love of like this imagined form of pure capitalism that I think they still haven't like, divorced themselves from the crippled epistemology of basically like good capitalism versus crony capitalism. So they want like moral capitalism, basically, where, J.D. Vance says up front, like in his speech, that, we have to decide like if a company is going to, I don't know, do something that's going to like harm our children. They're going to like flood the country with opioid drugs, or they're going to get my son addicted to pornography when he's like 12. Then, and, to say that he used an example of, Stacey Abrams opposing like a bill in Georgia that would have limited abortions by saying that this bill is bad for business. And he was like, she's right. It would be bad for business, but like conservatives need to step up and realize that like we basically can't be these like cowards that are like, oh, it's bad for business. Like you have to choose, like, do you care more about your moral principles or do you care about never doing anything that's like, quote, bad for business? And, he was saying that basically the Democrats have really sold themselves as like the amenable party of business. And they've come up with all these ways to like spin all kinds of things to basically make it sound like what they're doing is progressive when they're actually helping, the businesses that like sustain them, which is true, like to an extent. But you can kind of see that, like, okay, we need to stand up to
that were once good for business have become like, I think that at one time probably being like anti-racist was bad for business, or at least not unequivocally good for business. Now being like, anything but anti-racist in the United States.
In the big cities, at least.
Business.
Yeah.
Unless,
absolutely.
You're like a very niche market too. You have nothing to lose. Like, it's not like you're losing out by not being racist in any way, even in like small towns, I think.
No, for sure. And they're like there's something to watch out for there with like big corporations. J.D. Vance also says something interesting about how like during the BLM riots in Minneapolis, last year, that there was systematic fraud and underpayment. He almost sounds like Gustavus for a second, and says that there was like systematic underpayment of insurance payouts from the insurance companies for the small businesses that got burned down. Both black and white owned small businesses that all got burned down.
Thing, and I mean, like, it is a true thing that like if Bank of America gets destroyed, they're like in a better position to recover. That's how insurance companies tend to work. Like obviously Bank of America is good for it. Like they are very well insured. Like, so that is a true thing.
I just
However,
remember.
but I will,
Do you remember
I will
Catherine
modify,
Austin Fitts like last year with that like Planet Lockdown
course,
interview
yeah.
where she was basically like every city that got targeted by like these looters that burned down all the buildings were like in Federal Reserve Opportunity Zones.
Yeah.
And so like
well,
Amazon's going to go in and buy up all that
She also
property.
had a point about like the way that the lockdown ended up being advantageous and that there was a huge upward transfer of wealth. I think that was a fair point that she made amidst like some stuff that maybe not. But
no, you could look it up. Like it definitely was the largest transfer of wealth upward in history.
Yeah, right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I want to just modify what I said, which is that I think appearing to be anti-racist is like very important now. But I don't think that actually being, because I think that a lot of that stuff that they are like so fixated with, like having to go to a diversity workshop or whatever, like that's all about appearances.
Yeah.
Like that stuff doesn't actually, like, for all their talk about systemic racism, talking about how racism is systemic, theoretically down the line, that would be the first step, but it doesn't have to be. It could be. But it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And actually, like, making changes would be a huge disruption. And I don't think that there actually is much of an intent to do that. I've said this before about academia. Academia is still, despite, like, the horror and they think that, like, white genocide is, like, right around the corner because of, like, in academia or whatever. It's still, institutionally, I think, quite favorable to white people because most of the people in it are still white. And, like, there are certain things, like, a certain level of unconscious bias where people are more comfortable with people who remind them of themselves, like, or have, like, a certain, like, I think that is still a phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's changing. Maybe society's becoming different where they, and they might be attentive to wanting to have people of color, like, as a token. But I think that, that phenomenon still does exist. And a lot of the people who run academia are still quite old and, not
look at
retire.
Like Adrian Vermeule
and very
lost his fucking tenure.
Sometimes they, like me, have certain neurodivergencies that have been, named for their closed in or self-focused nature and their love of sameness. Not to say that, people with autism but I'm just saying racist. That a lot of academics you can see who they take on as advisees. They're people who remind them of themselves, not just because of race, but because of other personality features. Yeah. But race can be a factor in that for sure. Yeah. So, I'm just saying that.
And then the whole pipeline leading up to like getting to like a PhD level in the first place is so mediated by like structural inequalities and stuff that it just ends up, despite what everyone says, it ends up still being a pretty rarefied white space of a particular,
actual systemic changes would be bad for business. But there might be a way to change gradually that wouldn't be, and also, of course, I think that definitely racism on a global scale, or imperialism, is good for business, Zionism
exactly.
remains very good for business.
For access to the full-length episode, subscribe to the Hour of Frequency at patreon.com/subliminaljihad.